always been the type of person who put productivity over everything else. While all the other girls were out enjoying themselves, I worked as many hours as I possibly could. I learned a few years ago why I can't let myself get overworked like that again, though. Not after what happened when I was on my way home from working a double shift, which included an overnight. After unloading the shipment with the other 2 packers that we had at the Gap where I worked, we set up the store for the openers before heading home. It was about 3:30 in the morning by the time I got into my car and began what was supposed to be only a 10-minute drive to my house. As soon as I pulled out of the parking lot, I realized I was in trouble. Normally, I take the time to put my things in the back seat, but I was in such a rush to get home that I just carelessly tossed everything into the passenger seat beside me before heading off. If I had gone to put my things in the back seat, I would have realized that I wasn't alone in my car. I felt someone's hand reach over the back seat and grab onto my shoulder. They gripped down tightly as I felt the cold, sharp blade of a knife reach around my other shoulder and touch the side of my neck. He told me to be calm and just do what he said. As I tried to look back at him to see who it was, he tightened his grip on my shoulder and told me to keep my eyes on the road. At that moment, I noticed the hand that was holding the knife to my throat had moved away from me slightly. As the man gripped tighter with the other hand, I saw that as my only opportunity to get out of that situation. Right then, I decided to slam on the brakes as I leaned as far away from the blade as possible. The sudden stopping threw the man off balance in the back seat and caused him to fall forward off the seat, loosening his grip on my shoulder. This allowed me to get out of the car and start running. It only took him about 2 seconds to recover, as I heard the sound of his car door closing as he started to chase after me. Thankfully, my coworker had taken the same road just a little bit behind us and saw the man chasing me. I hopped into my coworker's car and locked the door. Once the man who tried to attack me realized I was out of reach, he returned to my car, hopped into the driver's seat, and drove off. We drove to the police station and filed a report before my coworker kindly dropped me off at my parents' house, where I spent the night. I was too afraid to go home and be by myself that night, considering what happened. It wasn't my first time going to Mexico, but it was my first time driving there. Honestly, I thought the most nerve-wracking part of the entire trip would be getting through the border. It wasn't that I was doing anything wrong, but I've always been nervous around people with guns, especially in situations like that where they ask you questions. Once I got to the border, though, I realized how simple it was, and there was nothing to worry about at all, at least not there. I made it across the border and toured the resort that I was going to be staying at, which was about 4 hours away. The first hour of the drive was nice because it was during the sunset hours, and everything around me was just painted with this nice orange-reddish hue. However, when it got dark, it got pretty creepy. Some portions of the drive were very well lit with a lot of streetlights, and then other parts would just be in total darkness with hardly any lighting at all. The scariest part was when I got about 2.5 hours into the drive. I was making my way down one of the darker portions of the road, and as I looked into the distance, I could see the reflection of my headlights hitting the tail lights of parked cars that had been turned off. I continued to drive forward, thinking there were just people parked on the side of the road for some reason. I wish I had stopped right then and there, because as I continued to drive forward past the parked cars, I noticed them turn on and pull out onto the road behind me. I tried to stay calm as I continued to drive forward, but I didn't make it far before I was forced to stop by 2 cars parked horizontally across the entire street. The 2 cars that were following me stopped behind me, and multiple men got out of each one. Right away, I noticed the guns that they were all carrying. One of them gently tapped on the window of my truck. I rolled it down, and, at first in Spanish, but followed by broken English, the man told me that for my safety, I needed to get out of my truck to pay a toll. I didn't know what to do, but when I hesitated, he repeated the same thing in English before trying to open the door of my truck. After a second of hesitation, I ended up getting out of my truck because I figured it was safer this way. I got ready to give the man my wallet so he could take as much money as he needed, but before I knew it, one of the guys was getting into my truck and began maneuvering it around us and the 2 cars behind us before driving off. I looked back at the one man that I was talking to, and he just had a smile on his face with his hand out as if he still expected money. I dropped my arms in defeat, which they took as a sign of disrespect, or possibly a threat, because the man in front of me quickly dragged me to the ground and began kicking me. He and his friends then took my wallet, uttered a few phrases in Spanish, and then all of the cars drove off in 2 separate directions. I was found walking along the side of the road by the Mexican authorities later that day, who brought me to the station and then to my resort. I decided to fly back home after my vacation, though. I was so shaken up that I didn't have any time to relax. Everyone I've talked to about it has claimed it was the cartel, because they need as many trucks as they can get their hands on. If I had been in a car, they might have just taken my money, according to a few people who have had similar experiences. I had just finished a night out of drinking with some friends in the city and was getting ready to head back to my apartment in Jersey when I went to catch a cab. I walked out of the bar and stood on the side of the road for about 2 minutes before one of the passing taxis pulled over for me. I noticed that the sign on top of his car that said "Taxi" wasn't lit up like it usually was, and the car seemed to be a bit off color. But I just figured it was dark, and I was a little bit drunk, so there was nothing wrong with it. I got into the cab and told the driver where I needed to go. The guy looked back at me and smiled as he said, "That'll be just fine." I was confused by that, but I once again just chalked it up to being a late night. I shut the door as I pulled myself into the taxi, and before I knew it, we were off. Even though I didn't live in the city, I visited all the time, and I knew the route back to my apartment from that area pretty well. So when we started heading toward the George Washington Bridge, I was really confused. I leaned forward in my seat and tried to explain to the driver that we were going the wrong way, and asked him if he was trying to run up the meter. When I went to look at the meter, I couldn't see it, which immediately made me suspicious. I'll never forget that weird, creepy smile on the driver's face when I asked him what was going on and if he was even a real cab driver. He chuckled a little bit. I sat back in my seat and began freaking out as we continued to head toward the bridge that would take us out of the city. I looked around and decided my best bet would be to make a run for it. But when I went to open the door, I realized that the child lock mechanism had been activated and I couldn't open the door from the inside. I began freaking out and screaming through the screen that separated the front and back seat of the driver, which only seemed to make him happier. I'll never forget what he said to me as we made our way onto the bridge. "Just give up now," he said, as he looked back at me through the rearview mirror. I wasn't ready for that, though, and thankfully, there was a bit of traffic on our side of the bridge, which gave me the perfect opportunity to try one last thing. As the car slowed down in the traffic, I began to elbow the window as hard as I could, When that didn't work, I decided to lie down in the seat and use my feet to kick it out. After 2 kicks, the third finally shattered the glass, and I quickly sat up. The driver began to panic and threw the car into the park, starting to get out as I wiggled my way out of the window and onto the bridge. The driver chased me for a second, but as soon as I saw a cop car in the mix of cars behind us, I immediately knew it was safe. I ran over to the officer and explained that the man had tried to kidnap me and wasn't a real taxi. At that point, the man tried to flee, but we were on a bridge, so there was no place for him to go. The police arrested him within a couple of minutes. After that, I was put into a real taxi, which the police called for to take me home. I'll be warier with the taxis I use from now on.